Hello, and welcome to the second module of our Trader Trainer program. My name is Paula Lawale Johnson, and I'm part of the Science-Based Target Network supporting corporate engagement. In this module, we'll be covering step 1 of the SBTN target setting process. BSR, one of our supporting partners, who has helped co-develop the Trader Trainer program, will kick off with the first set of technical training. As we move through the curriculum, you will hear from other supporting partners who have been involved in creating our methods or working directly with target setters. They will share their expertise, experiences, and some lessons learned to give you valuable insights to help you along the way. Before diving into the content of the Step 1 module, let's do a quick recap of the key concepts behind the Train the Trainer program, our rationale for launching the program, and our learning objectives for today. We at SBTN develop the Train the Trainer curriculum so users could 1. Get a clearer understanding and expertise on how to use our methods. 2. Gain confidence when using the recommended tools and resources. 3. Know where to go to for answers to questions about method interpretation. And finally, to feel empowered to engage with SBTN in our method development process. Our Train the Trainer curriculum comprises of 5 initial modules, covering the first 3 steps of our methods, as well as a general overview training, which establishes the foundations for engaging in the target setting process. As a general note, these modules align as much as possible with the corporate manual, as well as other supporting materials such as our case studies. The goal of this is to ensure alignment with key concepts and guidance, and to also ensure we streamline our content. We kicked off our training with our general overview module earlier this year in 2024. Now we are on module 2, which covers step 1, and soon we'll advance to module 3, which will focus on step 2 of our methods. The BSR team will now dive into the contents and objectives we're going to cover in this module for step 2.
Thank you, Paul, for this introduction. As mentioned earlier, BSR will be imparting the first technical training of this curriculum. For a bit of context, BSR is a global nonprofit sustainability network that works with around 300 members on a wide array of sustainability topics, including nature and biodiversity. And for today, you will have myself, Beatriz Solimaivan, and my colleague, Sundri Mubarak, impart this first training session. In this module, we will achieve 3 core objectives, starting with understanding the basics of Step 1 and how it fits within the overall SBTN framework, and following by understanding and conducting Step 1A materiality screening and the Step 1B value chain assessment. At the end of this module, you'll be able to answer any of the questions listed here, such as how to adequately define an organizational boundary or how to estimate pressures and state of nature. So let's get started. Our first objective is to help you understand the basics of Step 1, how it all fits within the overall methodology, and why it is important. At the core of all of SBTN's tools, methods, and guidance is a 5-step process that takes companies all the way from assessing their impacts with regards to specific pressures, identifying what parts of their operations and which locations to focus in on, to setting targets, all the way to measuring, reporting, and verifying progress against those targets. 2 unique aspects of this approach are first, that these targets are spatially explicit, reflecting the needs of nature in locations that company pressures occur in, and secondly, that actions must be guided by the SBTN's action framework of avoiding, reducing, regenerating, restoring, and transforming, consistent with the conservation and mitigation hierarchy of action. And today, we're at the beginning of that journey. So, what makes this step so important? Companies' economic activities have an impact on nature by transforming land, extracting resources, or releasing harmful emissions. In sustainability science, the ways in which an economic activity can affect nature are often called environmental pressures. However, not all pressures will be equally significant in terms of their impact on nature. Therefore, this methodology has been built so that a company may focus its target setting efforts on those pressures that are determined to be most material from that environmental and societal perspective. By following the Step 1 technical guidance, you will therefore achieve 2 objectives. First, you will gain a broad understanding of which of your company's economic activities and the environmental pressures they generate are material enough to warrant setting science-based targets for nature. And second, you will obtain the operational and environmental data for these activities that are requiring subsequent steps in the methods, which at the same time may also prove useful to support you in sustainability initiatives and responsibilities that are beyond the scope of the SBTN methods. So how does step 1 look like, and how does it break down? It is broken down into 2 steps. Step 1A is a quick and high-level process where you identify whether your economic activities are material in 8 pressure categories. Step 1B is a value chain assessment, which is a more resource-intensive process, but where activities are restricted to only those found material during the previous step. In this assessment, you will map the activities and value chains, quantify their resulting pressures on nature, and determine how healthy or fragile is the state of nature in your sourcing and operating locations. The specific inputs and outputs required across this process are outlined on the right-hand side of this slide for your reference. What's important for the relevance of this training is that after completing the Step 1 module, you will have decided if you will set targets for your enterprise as a whole or only for particular business units. You will have identified which of your company's pressures on nature are most material to set targets. You will have compiled data to quantify these pressures and the state of the nature across your value chain. And you will have identified what targets you need to set and for which of your activities. But before deep diving into the steps themselves, we wanted to highlight that SBTN and science-based targets for nature do not exist in a vacuum and are instead a part of a broader system, including environmental science, societal goals, impact management, target setting implementation, and reporting and disclosure. By aligning with the most widely used standards for impact assessment and reporting, SBTN enables companies to retain continuity with what they're already doing, using data and processes that are already in place, and through this target setting exercise, then can leverage this analysis for actual disclosures and regulatory compliance. In the case of Step 1, this is particularly important because of the relationship between assessment and reporting. For instance, they draw on the GHG protocol standards as a foundation for accounting embedded in the Step 1 method. And when climate is identified as material, they direct companies to the corporate standard and Scope 3 standards. Similarly, SBTN also looks to the EU directives, standards, and regulations to establish basic requirements for assessment and of environmental impacts. And the data collected through target setting can be leveraged for IFRS and ISSB recommendations. Finally, within the voluntary landscape, SBTN and TNFD work closely together to help companies incorporate nature into their decision-making processes in the most impactful and efficient way possible, where SBTN's guidance for science-based target setting is aligned with the disclosure recommendations of the TNFD.
Our second objective aims to support you in conducting Step 1A, where you determine the material pressures most likely to require target setting based on sector-level information. Before we get into the details, I'd like to kick off by highlighting the 5 tasks you will be expected to do for Step 1A. First, you'll need to define your company's organizational boundary. After compiling all the relevant inputs needed for this step, you will need to identify all your direct operations and upstream activities, as well as high-impact commodities in scope for the SBTN process. This will allow you to run the materiality screening using the materiality screening tool for both your direct operations and upstream activities. After that initial screening, you may refine the results of the screening and gather supporting and justificative evidence for SBTN's validation team where needed. So let's get started and look at what an organizational boundary is and how to define it. Your company's organizational boundary basically determines the broadest scope of the company's direct operations that will be covered in the methods. It will dictate which parts of the organization must be considered for the pressure screening that you'll be doing later on in Step 1B. The first thing you can do is check whether your company has already defined an organizational boundary in the past for other relevant frameworks such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, or for setting SBTI climate targets with which the SBTN's methodology is aligned. If this is the case, you're strongly recommended to use the same approach previously used. If diverging from previous approaches, you will need to be prepared to explain and justify this deviation to SBTN's validation team. If your company has not previously defined an organizational boundary, then you will have to choose one of three approaches to do so. In alignment with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, SBTN recommends you use either the financial or operational control approach over the equity share approach. Companies must include the business operations that are part of their organizational boundary at the time of submission. Significant restructuring of their operations, i.e., if they buy or sell a business operation, may need them to redefine their organizational boundary and resubmit their Step 1 assessment or Step 3 targets for validation. Let's now look into the pressures that are going to be in scope for the assessment. According to the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, there are 5 direct drivers that contribute most to the loss of nature globally. These are land and sea use change, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasion of alien species. These 5 direct drivers from the IPBES are equivalent to 12 pressure categories defined by SBTN in alignment with ENCORE, and which you can see on the table here. In Step 1A, companies must screen their direct operations and upstream value chain activities against 8 of these 12 categories, as shown on the table, to determine which pressures need to be assessed in Step 1B, and later on, which targets will need to be set in Step 3. Out of these 8, there are 4 that have associated SBTN methods to help set targets on in Step 3, and a 5th, which is linked to SBTi's climate targets, that's GHG emissions. The other 3 pressure categories related to marine and freshwater ecosystem use and change and species extraction are required, but methods are still under development. The 4 remaining categories are optional. Now that you know which pressures are in scope, let's see how you can identify direct operations and upstream activities that will have to be screened. But first of all, why do you have to classify economic activities? Well, information on economic activities is commonly used to assess materiality, to manage data on impact, and to convey information on impacts to different types of stakeholders. For ease of analysis in Step 2, it's recommended that companies sort their upstream data by commodity or activity category using ISIC codes. To complete Step 1A materiality screening, companies must classify all their direct operations activities into categories found in the United Nations 4th International Standard Industrial Classification of All Economic Activity Scheme, that's ISIC. If companies use other common schemes, such as the Global Industry Classification Standard, these must be translated to ISIC classifications. This can be done using the crosswalk tables within the MST, and we recommend that companies use keyword searches to facilitate rapid use of these resources. Let's look at an example for ISIC classification in direct operations. To find the correct category group to describe packaging activities, for example, you must find the activity focused on the actual wrapping of products and not the generation of packaging materials. As for upstream, for the screening step, Step 1A, companies are only required to include the Tier 1 activities associated with the company's production inputs of purchased goods. However, in the value chain assessment, companies will also be required to include the tier associated with the highest impact for each material pressure category. You'll have to provide a list of all your company's high-impact commodities and conversion-driving commodities, recorded as volumes, including raw materials and ingredients, semi-finished and finished goods made by processing or transforming of raw materials. Over the next slide, we cover the specifics required for the inclusion of high-impact commodities. Finally, one thing to note is that while the list of IUCN CITES species will be required in Step 1B, it is recommended to locate and identify this information during this step. If your company has existing lists in their public communications or reports, These may be accepted by SBTN if they contain the required information. All right, what are high-impact commodities and how can your company identify them? For some context, the high-impact commodity list was developed to simplify the upstream assessment and to ensure that companies include commodities known to be most responsible for driving deforestation, nutrient pollution, and other impacts. The high-impact commodity list can be used to 1. Prioritize upstream assessment in a way that's environmentally robust in Step 2, and 2. Focus upstream traceability efforts for commodities and upstream activities without precise location information. Companies must indicate whether they are engaged in the primary production or extraction of high-impact commodities or conversion-driving commodities as part of their direct operations. They must also identify whether any of their purchased goods are derived from or contain high impacts or conversion-driving commodities, as well as the state or form in which they were purchased. Companies should only focus on purchased goods that are used as production inputs for their activities and may ignore purchased goods that are used for other uses. So companies should therefore reference the high-impact commodity list to ascertain whether any of their purchased inputs, raw ingredients to finished goods, will be required for inclusion in the Step 1A materiality screening and Step 1B value chain assessment. For Step 1A, they shall list the high-impact commodities linked to direct operations and upstream activities, using this tool to record the categories of high-impact commodities to include in their screening and assessment, as well as the categories of pressures which must be assessed in Step 1B. As for embedded or highly transformed commodities, while they may not be readily impaired in procurement data, they must still be accounted for. Let's now look at a practical example. Ursus Nourishment is a food and beverage producer that specializes in plant-based drinks and food and reaches a global market of consumers through third-party retailers. The company has many activities required for producing and finishing goods within their direct operations, like crop production, processing of raw commodities, and packaging of finished goods. In addition to these, they also have upstream and downstream activities dispersed around the globe. They purchase major commodities including almonds, soybean, timber in the form of paperboard, as well as other ingredients such as sugar from sugarcane and additives. So to get started, the Ursus team reviewed its procurement sheet for any commodities that were derived from or contained high-impact commodities and found that 6 of their core inputs contained high-impact commodities. These are cocoa, corn or maize, soybeans, sugarcane, timber, and tree nuts, almonds. Now, one of the commodities it was sourcing showed up in the SBTN high-impact commodity list twice, once as timber and once as pulp, cellulosics, paper, paperboard, cardboard, tissue. This means that there are multiple high-impact nodes in this commodities supply chain. They found additional guidance on what to do in this case in the README for the high-impact commodity list and understood that because there are different sets of pressures associated with these 2 phases of production, they must list both in their record for validation and aim to provide the spatial and pressure data for both activities in the Step 1B value chain assessment. The team also noted the form in which the high-impact commodities were found: raw materials, semi-processed, or fully transformed. Now let's look at the materiality screening tool, which is the interactive tool that allows companies to select categories of business activities and receive pressure scores for them. It contains a linked sheet to summarize these activities and pressure scores, which can be used as your company's output template from Step 1A and submit it for validation. A second linked sheet that shows the upstream activities associated with your company's business activities, direct operations, and the scores for these. The tool will use companies' direct operations data to generate a list of economic activities expected to be in their upstream, expressed using the group level from ISIC. Companies will be able to then sense check this by referencing their procurement data and any previous analyses. And then there's also the full data set of materiality scores for direct operations, calculated by mapping the Encore database. As for how to leverage the materiality screening tool, you can see on this slide the 7-step process, all the way from inputting data and listing the company's activities using preferred economic activity schemes, to reviewing the list of high-impact commodities highlighted by the tool as being most relevant and refine them. You can also refer to SBTN's recorded demo, which is a video that shows in detail how to use the materiality screening tool. After the screening, you might have to interpret and refine the materiality results. For example, some specific pressures might not seem material at the group level, while some production processes might have been deemed material. In this case, the screening process for these production processes has to be carried forward to Step 1B, or else evidence to support their exclusion from further screening will have to be provided to meet validation requirements. As for no data values for a specific pressure, companies that don't assess that pressure in 1B will still be able to meet the validation requirements. However, the no data does not mean no impact, and we expect that future iterations of the MST will cover these data gaps. That means that a future round of screening could reveal these activities to be material and required for assessment and target setting. Therefore, it's strongly recommended to submit evidence to justify the inclusion or exclusion of activities used on information gathered by your company. There are also cases where a company might want to exclude pressures that have been found to be material. Now, the materiality screening tool reflects a high-level understanding of impacts at a global or non-spatially explicit level and are expressed as a sectoral average or typical impact profile of a company in a given sector. Therefore, companies may find that their activities and impacts are not well represented in the current tool. In those cases, provide data justifying the inclusion or exclusion of activities and/or pressures, as well as the rationale and justification, including relevant methodologies, and submit them as a separate file attachment so that the SBTN's validation team can ratify their justification. Validators may recommend or require to continue assessing and evaluating impacts for that activity or pressure. Examples of appropriate justification can be magnitude, irreversibility, frequency of impact, or likelihood or timing. Now, if we go back to our case study, Ursus used the materiality screening tool to screen their direct operations activities and obtain scores for their applicable production processes for each activity. They used the ISIC classification system for their business activities and arrived at 3 main group categories, which you can see on the tables here, and which are the manufacture of other food products, the growing of non-perennial crops, and business support service activities. Now, once they selected these and input them into the tool automatically provided them with scores ranging from 3 to 9. To help with interpretation of the tool scores, they identified all cells with red text, which were over the global threshold for materiality in that pressure category, meaning that that sector's activities have a highly material contribution to that pressure category. All cells with yellow text were below the threshold for that category. In some cases, they found the score no data, which signifies In some cases, they found the score ND, which signifies no data, which is recorded for a certain pressure in the tool. When looking at the group category, growing of non-perennial crops, it seems there were multiple production processes associated. After some consideration, they took the average value of all the production processes that apply to the company and or the value of the relevant production process if only one applied to the company. In this example, the URSUS team knew that of the 4 applicable production processes for crop growing, both the large-scale irrigated crop and small-scale irrigated crop processes were accurate descriptions of their activities. The team recorded their logic for excluding production processes where this was the case for validation. After reinterpreting the production processes to reflect its actual operations, the URSUS team arrived at the second table, which you can see here, within which they recorded their final materiality results. Of the 3 activities within their direct operations, the team found that growing of crops was consistently most intensive across the pressure categories. The team judged this intensity as the number of pressures per activity above the median materiality score for each pressure in this dataset consulted. Moving on to the upstream segment, the URSUS team carried out the screening exercise using both the SBTN materiality screening tool and the high impact commodity list. In this example, we only show the results of the high impact commodity list, which incorporates information from the screening tool and complements this with insights from additional research. So URSUS first leveraged SBTN's high impact commodity list. When using this tool, we can see that out of the 8 commodities screened, 7 were deemed material across all 5 pressures, with the exception of paperboard and cardboard, which were material for 4 out of the 5 pressures. For context, an X indicates sufficient evidence to indicate materiality of that pressure in the processing or initial production stage for that commodity. As previously mentioned, because URSUS is sourcing paperboard, they also include timber in their record of high-impact commodities. They know that for that commodity, the material pressures are not only those listed for paperboard itself, which reflect the processes associated with pulp and paper processing, but also those pressures listed for timber, which reflects the process of cultivating and harvesting timber for commercial use. In a later stage, they recorded both the commodities sourced and the upstream activities associated with these. To sum up, after completing the assessment using the materiality screening tool, you'll be expected to record the following: 2 separate screenings of your value chain activities, one for your direct operations and another one for your upstream. A record indicating whether you have used the values and materiality thresholds at the group or production process level. A record indicating whether any of the production processes associated with your activity group do not accurately describe your activities. And a record indicating whether any of the production processes assessed, separately or in association with a group, are over the materiality threshold. SBTN recommends companies organize materiality screening tool results for validation as a separate file attachment and have released a beta version of their desired data templates for companies to fill out information on both steps 1 and 2.
Let's now dive into step 1B. Now that step 1A is finalized and material activities as well as high impact and conversion driving commodities have been identified, you will have to conduct a full value chain assessment. Here are the 4 tasks you'll be expected to go through. The first entails selecting business units for target setting. For the second, you will map your company's value chain activities and locations. Once that is done, you will then quantify the environmental pressures of the activities depending on the type of data available. On our last task, you will be able to assess the state of nature in each location. So let's start with the business unit approach. Why and when do we use it? The objective of the business unit approach is to allow large, complex companies to get started on target setting by focusing on the most prepared and/or impactful parts of their business. It is also appropriate for those subsidiaries or units with a centralized decision-making authority where there is leadership buy-in and where they are ready to set targets before there is complete buy-in from the parent company. As for how to use it, this approach can only be considered after completing the materiality screening for the full organizational boundary and after showing that the selected business unit has material elements applicable for target setting, based on an environmental impact lens. They must provide evidence of the business unit's capacity to drive the science-based target process, providing there is sufficient operational autonomy and leadership buy-in, and noting that the relative size of the business unit as an expression of percentage of revenue. They will also then justify their selection following the criteria laid out on the technical supplement. Those using this approach will be encouraged to expand and improve the traceability of their business units, ideally starting with the most impactful ones. Let's now move on with what should be covered in this assessment. For direct operations, the analysis must be across 100% of the material activities recorded in Step 1A according to each pressure category. For upstream, companies must assess 100% of all EUDR listed commodities in their sourcing, 90% of all high-impact commodity volumes, and 67% of their total source volumes that were identified as material for each pressure category. These percentages are mutually inclusive. In other words, the 100% counts towards the 90, and the 90 counts towards the 67, and they are calculated separately for each pressure category. Companies should ultimately aim to assess 100% of their upstream value chains. They should include all procurement of production inputs over the last 5 years, but can exclude procurement for discontinued activities. As such, you should treat the 67% coverage as an initial objective for your first round of target setting and aim to expand out to over 95% over the 5-year target assessment period. For companies that source animal-derived products such as leather, eggs, meat, or dairy, they need to account for and include in their assessment any EUDR-listed commodities found or estimated to be found in the animal feed used to produce these products. Aside of the 100% of EUDR-listed commodity volumes, all companies must assess 90% of that high-impact commodity volumes. Those will contribute to the 67% threshold as mentioned earlier, so it's best to first calculate what that proportion of your upstream procurement comes from and to prioritize those high-impact commodities in their assessment. For high-impact commodities, companies need to assess the pressures associated with the most impactful value chain stage for the pressure category they are assessing. In most cases, it's expected that this will be the primary production, so for example, agriculture, fishing, or mining. But in some sectors, and particularly looking at pressures related to the pollution category, it's possible that impacts are concentrated in other value chain stages, such as industrial processing. Companies need to identify for each product they source and for each material pressure category which are the most impactful stages and focus their pressure assessment on those. In some cases, that might mean that multiple unit processes and locations need to be included for a given commodity if they are the most important. Companies need to identify for each product they source and for each material pressure category which is the most impactful stage and focus their pressure assessment on it. In some cases, this might mean that multiple unit processes and locations need to be included for a given commodity if they are the most important for different pressures. For example, production may be the highest for land use change, but processing may be the highest for water use. For all other products they are assessing that are not high-impact commodities, they can assess any production or transformation value chain stage. For example, manufacturing or assembly. But primary production is also allowed, and companies can choose what to focus on here. Finally, for calculating and estimating total volumes, companies should use a total volume source in a representative year that reflects normal operating conditions. And what we mean by representative is the average of the last 5 years. Now a quick note on the inclusion of pressures. When the results of Step 1A show that an activity is material for a given pressure category, you will have to assess one or a couple of pressure indicators in that category for that activity. For example, if an activity is material for the category of land use and land use change, you will have to assess 2 indicators. First, the land use, and second, land use change for that activity. In categories such as soil pollution, 1 indicator is required, nutrient volume applied to soil per area, and others are optional. SBTN does not require companies to assess their GHG emissions directly, but they are requiring companies to set climate targets with SBTI guidance for the activities material for that pressure category. Now, to complete Step 1B for direct operations, you will need quantified values for the material pressures of all of your sites with location data identified at minimum at the subnational level. It is recommended but not required that you obtain these through measurements rather than estimates. For the record, a measurement is a value that you get from sensors, site plans, or other such resources, as opposed to an estimate, which you can obtain through models if you are able to get measurements. For upstream, you will need a list of all procurement used as a production input, identifying what of this procurement is or contains high-impact commodities and any IUCN red-listed or CITES trade-regulated species. In this process, you will have to identify what percentage of each of the products you procure is a high-impact commodity material and calculate for each product the tonnage that comes from them and state in which state the commodity is found, that is, raw, semi-processed, or transformed form. As mentioned earlier, you will need to trace the locations of these volumes, but in the case of upstream, there is no minimum spatial resolution level required. The more precise data you get, the better for later stages of the product, but using subnational data or national is also acceptable. Companies that can't trace a particular volume to any location can also label the location as unknown, and that is acceptable too. For all value chain locations, estimated state of nature values will also be included here. Now that we've listed the data requirements, you should determine where you have complete missing or partial data available. Past data collection efforts, either through recent assessments, certifications, or other initiatives that involve data gathering, might help you do that. And for instance, companies that have a full GHG inventory for climate science-based targets should be able to take advantage of that. In any case, for most, gathering the data required for Step 1B will require coordination and inputs across different key functions departments, such as R&D, manufacturing, logistics, and so on. It is recommended that a central data collection lead or team be identified to coordinate and facilitate these data collection efforts. And SBTN's self-assessment tool can be a very useful checklist to ensure that data collected fulfills the need and requirements for SBTN validation. While it is unlikely that many companies will be able to gather the data needed with 100% certainty or accuracy, it is recommended that they use best estimates, and there are multiple tools and resources out there to facilitate the lack of known data. Companies should also use the data gathering process as an opportunity to document current gaps in data availability and begin plans to strengthen internal capacity and data availability through these tools, systems, resources, approaches, and so on, which will facilitate not only the SBTN target setting process, but also the company's availability and ability to comply with emerging regulation, reporting, and disclosure. Now, here's an example of a typical output of this task. Here, Ursus Nourishment first compiled a list of operational sites associated with different activities and specific locations using data available internally. The company also sent questionnaires to facility managers to provide the size of the company's farms and surrounding land included in the estimate. The team recorded the basins and ecoregions, knowing this data would be needed as they moved along using the SBTN Unified Water Layers and the Resolve database. As mentioned, companies can also decide to get ahead and simultaneously gather primary data on certain pressures if that data already exists and is readily available. In the case of Ursus, they utilize the data for water use and UG emissions, which they stored in their existing environmental management system. For upstream, Ursus compiled a list of commodities associated with different magnitudes and volume and their source and locations. They were able to pinpoint locations based on supplier information, and where this wasn't available, they selected countries to include in the assessment that were most likely origin sites for their commodities purchased, based on economic trade data. To ensure they linked their pressure estimates to the right locations, the team first consulted their procurement sheets to see from which countries these commodities were grown and did a review of the scientific literature and databases focused on commodities to ensure that sourcing was indeed the highest impact node for all pressures in their upstream value chains, and confirmed this to be the case for all commodities and pressures with the exception of paperboard, cardboard from timber, which entailed additional significant water use and pollution impacts beyond, or in some cases comparable to, the production of timber. The company recorded the volume of the purchased goods, the high impact commodity used to produce that product, and then estimated the raw tons for the commodity in cases where the raw production phase was the activity of highest impact. Moving on to the pressure estimation, there are two ways to estimate pressures depending on the type of data available. The first option, assessing pressures using observational data, what we call measurements, is taking when locations of activities are known. In the case of upstream activities, these may only be available to companies with strong supplier relationships and may need additional verification by the company before submission for validation. This approach will yield the best data to prioritize locations in Step 2 and set targets in Step 3, as the values will be specific to the company's activities. Therefore, companies should use a measurements approach whenever possible. Option 2, which involves estimating pressures using the best available data and quantitative modeling, aka estimations, is used when locations are assumed. In this case, companies rely on the use of pre-existing quantitative models to generate pressure estimates using a specific company data as an input. This will likely be the case for upstream, where companies can use volume-based estimation depending on the nature of available data. For those that need to use this approach for the direct operations, please note they will need to provide a process explanation, including the list of sites or activities for which observational data was not used, explain why this was not used, and detail the alternative approach used. As mentioned, companies may use quantitative models or tools for pressure estimation, such as life cycle impact assessment approaches. SBTN recommends that, where possible, companies use models that produce estimates representative of the actual activities undertaken and are consistent with SBTN tool and data criteria listed in the actual guidance. You can refer to that on SBTN Step 1 toolbox and select the tools that best measure companies' available data, as well as the range of pressures it must assess. For your reference, we have listed some of the tools recommended by SBTN here, which you will be able to go through after this training. Going back to ERSAs, this table here shows an example of quantified pressures for direct operations across the 5 pressures that were material based on Step 1A results. In this task, ERSAs had already compiled primary data on water use and UG emissions for production facility. The company then used a mix of resources to estimate remaining pressures using FAO for land use and land use change, and Mekonnen and Hoekstra 2012 for water pollution for all agricultural commodities. Similarly, the ERSAs team quantified upstream pressures using measurements where possible and estimations otherwise. For certain upstream pressures, the ERSAs team had to use information about one pressure to calculate another. For instance, water use pressures were based on the amount of crops produced, and water pollution pressures were based on the amount of land use in that location. In this way, the company's estimates of their land use pressure informed their calculation of the pollution pressure. Volumes were the key input to calculate land use change and water use.
Assessing the state of nature is the next crucial step to contextualize the significance of a company's pressures in each location. To kick off, companies should use the data on activities and locations collected for the pressure assessment and extract the list of locations for use in spatial tools. Before beginning the assessment, companies must consider the level of precision in their pressure data to determine the locations to use for the state of nature assessment. For example, the country or set of countries estimated as probable sourcing locations. They must then connect the material pressures to state of nature indicators. Because we're using multiple spatial indicators to assess the state of nature, it is vital to ensure these rely on the same spatial resolution. We'll be using this information to understand the contextual significance of a company's pressures in each location, so remember to use this same spatial resolution used for assessing your company's pressures. On the next slide, we'll be walking you through the different sets of spatial indicators you can use for your state of nature assessment. As we go through those, it's important to remember that the indicators you end up using should be appropriate to the place where your company's impacts are happening. For example, are you picking a biodiversity indicator that is appropriate for the realm in focus, whether it's terrestrial, freshwater, or marine? For ease of analysis, and based on the insights of the initial target validation group, we also recommend that when you estimate the state of nature for one pressure at a time, for example, land use, that you cover all locations for that pressure at once. So what are the different sets of spatial indicators that you can use for your state of nature assessment? There are basically 2 types of spatial indicators. The first is pressure-sensitive state of nature indicators, or SONP. These indicators are appropriate to summarize the features of the state of nature most directly connected to the pressure being assessed. And the second is biodiversity-sensitive state of nature indicators, or SONB. To complement the analysis possible using pressure-sensitive state of nature indicators, SBTN requires companies to use at least 2 biodiversity-specific indicators one at the species level and one at the ecosystem level. If your company used ecosystem condition or integrity indices, such as the Ecosystem Integrity Index, to represent pressure-sensitive state of nature, they must use a complementary species-level indicator of biodiversity. Note that for Step 1 and 2 within V1.1 methods, you can consult a non-exhaustive list, including species endemism, species extinction risk, ecosystem integrity or condition, ecosystem connectivity, among others. Now let's look at the requirements for different state of nature data and tools that you can use. As mentioned, SBTN requires companies to use pressure-sensitive indicators in Step 1 and 2 to capture the more direct impacts of a given pressure on nature. For these indicators, companies must consider current state of nature values, i.e. values from the recent past and present, as this present and historical impact-focused approach is more compatible with the type of information companies are required to use for measuring and estimating pressures. Again, recent, past, or present, based on data availability. In addition, when completing the value chain assessment, you are strongly recommended to use state of nature data that's compatible with the spatial and temporal scale of the pressure data you have collected, i.e. data which is delineated along similar political and natural boundaries and cover a similar period of time. When the spatial resolution of pressure and recommended state of nature data for a specific location are not equal, the finer scale data should be aggregated to the coarser of the two scales. Now, some state datasets may provide information as continuous scales, for example, from 0 to 1,000, whereas categorical values, for example, from very low to very high. Where possible, companies are recommended to take the numerical values from the continuous scale for ease of analysis in Step 2. Companies should also check that all datasets used apply a consistent logic of interpretation. For example, high values indicate higher urgency of action. To select indicators, you may refer to the Step 1 toolbox to find the most appropriate tools to assess the state of nature. Different tools will cover different types of state of nature indicators, and the Step 1 toolbox has identified those tools for you with data on these indicators or data which can easily be translated into these indicators for a smooth validation submission. Once you've shortlisted which tools will help your state of nature assessment, you should be ready to conduct the assessment. Let me go back to our case study to see how Ursus Nourishment completed their state of nature assessment. For this task, the Ursus team used the data on activities and locations collected for their pressure assessment and extracted the list of locations to use in spatial tools. It began connecting their material pressure to state of nature indicators, working on one pressure at a time and covering all locations for that pressure at once. For each selected dataset, values were taken for the most granular scale possible, depending on their starting data for that activity. In terms of tools and state of nature indicators, for the pressure-sensitive state indicator SONP, linked to land use change or conversion, Ursus used the percent of the landscape that remains intact. For the SONP linked to land use, it used the Ecoregion Integrity Index. For water, the team used the Unified Water Availability Layer required by SBTN as the SONP linked to water withdrawals, and the Unified Water Pollution Layer required by SBTN as the SONP for water pollution. For the required biodiversity metric SONB, the team used the START layer with an IBAT to assess species extinction risk. As the team selected tools, they were careful to verify that each layer used to assess the state of nature was capturing the current state or changes in state, and not pressures or some combination of pressures and states. Using these resources, Ursus generated state of nature estimates for each of the locations associated with its direct operations and upstream value chains. The table here provides an example of those state of nature estimates for a unique location linked to a given operational site. Note that when multiple tools are selected, companies must ensure that they use the same logic to interpret the values, i.e. that all data across indicators have the same directionality and can be interpreted as low values equal less urgent action, lower priority, and high values equals more urgent action and higher priority, for example. Given URSUS used the same state of nature indicators for direct operations and upstream activities, here's a bit more information on how it extracted values for each indicators. Let's start with land use. To use the Ecoregion Integrity Index to gather state data, URSUS conducted a rapid review of likely sourcing regions for their upstream activities within each of the countries where they knew their goods to be derived from, and used these to select appropriate locations within the index. Once they had this information, they were then ready to match the ecoregions in which they knew they were operating, direct operations, and their assumed sourcing activities upstream to the unique ecoregion ID used in the Ecoregion Integrity Index. To do this, they consulted the map of ecoregions provided by Resolve. And then, using the Ecoregion Integrity Index, the team had to rescale the data such that the least intact landscapes had higher values, so that the logic of interpretation is consistent with the other state of nature tools. To do this, they subtracted the index value for each location from 1, so that 0 equals a landscape with full integrity, and 1 is equivalent to a landscape that is fully degraded. Now let's look at land use change. To estimate the SONP for land use change, URSUS similarly aggregated scores by ecoregion when specific basins or locations were known. They then looked at changes in land use cover in each ecoregion for the most recent year with available data. In this example, the team used land cover data from 2021. For the percent of the landscape that is not intact, the team calculated the percent of land that was cropland or built up/urban. For water use and water pollution, the team looked at the unified water tool and took average values for the set of basins used in the tool that matched the level of granularity they had at hand. So for example, for the UK Northwest Basin where they operate, they took the average value of all the smaller basins shown in the tool. For upstream locations, the team took the average value for all basins in that country for its upstream estimates. This process was repeated for each SONP category: water use, water availability, and water pollution. For upstream, this basin information matched their sourcing region research conducted for land. Finally, let's look at biodiversity. For the START dataset, the company took the median score of all species START scores within each country to determine upstream states. As an example of what a supporting tool would look like, here's the Ecoregion Integrity Index that the company used to gather values for the SONP linked to land use, conducting a rapid review of likely sourcing regions for upstream activities within each of the countries where they knew their goods were derived from, and using these to select appropriate locations within the index. We already spoke a little bit about how they matched the ecoregions in which they knew they were operating to unique ecoregion IDs, and then finally subtracted index values for each location from 1 to have a score of 0, which is equivalent to a landscape with full integrity, and 1, which is equivalent to a landscape that is fully degraded. Once all these tasks have been performed, companies should use the SBTN self-assessment tool and validation submission form to confirm the alignment with the methods and validation criteria. This slide covers a list of items that the validation team is going to be expecting to see. If you have to retain something to complete step 1, you will need to record your state of nature information alongside your pressure data for each site activity location pair in your direct operation dataset, and for each commodity location or activity location pair in your upstream dataset.
Before we wrap up today's session, let us end with some quick takeaways for you. Now that you're more familiar with the step 1 process, you might be wondering about other considerations before jumping into this process. We urge you to think about key factors such as the associated time, expertise, and financial resources companies might incur when going through this process. For insight from the ITVG pilot, we know typically companies take around 2 to 6 months to go fully through the Step 1 and 2 process, which could often be influenced by their previous data availability, their in-house capabilities, and whether or not they had external supporting organizations assisting them. On that note, this marks the end of our first module. So what are the key lessons you should be living with? Take the knowledge test and test your learnings from this module. A link to the test will be made available on SBTN's portal after the module is released. Users seeking to become or continue to be part of the SBTN referral program will be able to take this test as many times as needed to pass and certify their understanding of each module. And as a reminder, they will need to pass to remain within the referral list. Finally, in the next module, we will focus on Step 2, Interpret and Prioritize. In this second step, a company leverages the insight from the assessment phase and ranks all locations in their target boundaries by the importance of action there and then to define a short list of top priority locations for initial target setting. Users of this module will learn how to organize their operational and location data accordingly so as to prepare for the target setting phase in Step 3, for which we also have modules. Last but not least, I want to remind you that within all of the trainings that will be released, we'll find a final section and additional resources that you can consult for additional information on SBTN tools, guidance, and the corporate manual and those case studies that we've depicted today and throughout the course of this curriculum. And with that, thank you very much and have a lovely day. See you soon.